Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK. I'm joined today by my colleagues, PRWeek editor-in-chief Danny Rogers and senior reporter Evie Barrett. Now, you may have heard that we have a new government. Labour proved the polls right and recorded a massive win in the general election, which means, of course, that Keir Starmer is our new Prime Minister. This followed an election campaign that has thrown up plenty of talking points. In this episode, we're going to discuss the election and, more importantly, what we can expect from a Labour government. But firstly, let's just catch up on the night itself. Where did you both watch the coverage? Was it a late one?
For me, I actually didn't stay up that late and watch it. I think it's weird. I did in 2019, but this time almost, obviously you don't want to completely believe the polls, but I felt like we were sort of in safe hands. So I caught up on a lot of it this morning.
Yeah, I was pretty much the same as Evie. In fact, I watched it from about 10 o'clock when the exit polls came out, and they seemed to be pretty accurate, actually, as it transpired. Nothing much happened. I stayed up until about 2 in the morning, and there really wasn't very much in the way of results. So I went to bed and woke up 6 or 7 in the morning and checked the results, and they were, as stunning as the exit polls had said. It was also Andy Murray's farewell at Wimbledon last night. I don't know if you guys saw that, but that was quite emotional. Somebody else saying goodbye in a rather more warm way than Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, no, I didn't. That passed me by, to be honest. I actually went to an industry event last night. I thought I'd go along to the CIPR Held a Drinks event near Westminster. So I was chatting to a lot of public affairs and politicos and comms folk and just having a few drinks and lots of chat and predictions about what might happen. And then we all stopped for the exit poll. And like you both, it was a moment of realisation that actually it was going to be a Labour landslide. And, I probably stayed for another half hour or so. Then I went home and exactly the same. I probably went to bed about 1. And I think there were only like 6 or 7 declared at that point. And then they presumably came in a rush. So I didn't feel the need to stay up much later.
So we're all remarkably fresh today.
Absolutely, which is a good thing. So obviously we've all been transfixed by the ups and downs of this election campaign over the past 6 weeks or so. I wrote a piece on Friday, 8 lessons from the campaigns for the comms industry, looking at issues like how brands can be detoxified, whether PR stunts can still pack a punch, and the impact of social media spend. So it'd be good to talk about these campaigns before they get consigned to history. What do you think, in terms of strategies, have been the most successful during the campaign, would you say?
Well, I thought your piece was very good, John, and I recommend that most of our listeners have a look on that on PRWeek.com, because it goes into a lot of detail on the specific tactics and the specific campaign, the things that worked and the things that didn't for various parties. But I always think that campaigns, and specifically political campaigns, you can only really measure their success on whether you win or not. And Labour won, and they won absolutely massively. So when you talk about strategy, the only thing that matters is that you win a big, big majority. And Labour's majority was, it looks like, more than 170, which is pretty similar to Labour in 1997, an absolute landslide. And Labour's strategy is not dissimilar this year from Tony Blair's strategy in 1997. As you say in your piece, the Labour Party parked their tank on the Tories' lawn in lots of senses, in patriotism, low taxes, in economic management, in law and order. And he pulled it off. Keir Starmer pulled it off with aplomb.
The way you framed it, John, the fact that for the most part they actually use quite safe, predictable strategies and news lines, that kind of Ming Vase strategy thing did seem to work. What I quite liked was the fact that they did take that different tone of voice on social media, particularly addressing the younger voters and holding their attention. I mean, from my perspective, thinking of people my age, that did seem to work and engage more of a younger group of voters as well. So I think addressing it differently for different age groups seemed to go in their favour too.
We'll see, won't we, when the full analysis is out as to which demographics voted which way. So I think Evie's point is a very good one. We don't yet know whether young people voted largely in favour of Labour, and therefore whether their TikTok and social media strategies work. But I guess they must have done if the results are so good.
One of the things I put into my article was the kind of comparing the stats to how much was spent by the different parties on ads, where they could spread their social media content. I mean, there was quite a stark difference in terms of the amount spent with Google, Labour spending more than 10 times what the Tories were spending, for example. And they were also spending significantly more on Meta, which obviously has Facebook and Instagram. So it feels like they got it right in terms of, in my view anyway, in terms of the sort of tone and the kind of shareability and memification of campaigning. But it was also backed by some hefty chunks of money, and that was one of Labour's advantages. Not that many donors were willing to support the Tories when it seemed like they were on the way out, whereas Labour have obviously been more successful on that front recently. So, yeah, I agree. I think it was a combination of good, solid idea of viral social media strategy backed by money. So they used their sort of financial advantage. I was impressed by Ed Davey and the Liberal Democrats and their approach to using Davey as a sort of one-man stunt machine. But it was a really good way to, it's a simple strategy. And let's face it, all types of brands and corporations use these strategies from time to time, but just have good photo opportunities because those have been hard to come by, certainly better than the traditional politician with a hard hat on. So it does feel like they were successful, like acting like a disruptor in the sense that you can't assume that people are going to want to report what you're going to say because you're a very minor party compared to some of the others. So you really got to go out there and do some punchy stunts and give people reason to cover you. And as I wrote in my piece, I think the Lib Dems did quite well to focus on the fact that Davey is actually quite an affable person. And I think he got a lot of sympathy for his kind of slightly dad dancing approach to life. But actually, there was substance behind it. He was making serious points about policy, but he was also talking in interviews about his own experience of the care sector, for example, looking after his disabled son. So I think the Lib Dems have been one of the victors. And yes, there would have been tactical voting to get the Tories out, but I definitely feel like the Lib Dems have had a pretty good strategy. What do you think about the Lib Dems and Ed Davey?
I think you're right. I think Ed Davey really utilised the photo opportunities that he had and got people's attention in more of a friendly way and got his policies across that way rather than trying to get people to trudge through manifestos, things like that. Like you say, he just came across as a nice guy. And I think where the Lib Dems didn't really have much to lose, they could afford to take that approach.
What about reform? Lots of talk about reform. They obviously performed pretty well. I thought, to be honest, they'd have more seats than they did. I think they won 4, but given the nature of the first past the post system, but they certainly had an impact. Were you surprised how well they performed, and how do you sum up their election campaign?
Yeah, I thought reform was the big story other than Labour winning. 15% of the vote for a hard right party is a big deal. They got about 14% more than they got in 2019, although I think they were called something else in 2019. It's both impressive and I think possibly for most of us deeply worrying that a hard right party got such a significant share of the vote. And I do think a large part of that is because Nigel Farage is a good communicator. I think people listen to him where maybe they don't listen to the likes of Sunak, even Starmer. We're not seeing the rise of the far right in the levels that you're seeing it in France and other parts of the world at the moment, but you are seeing it. So it's a significant issue.
I was very interested to see whether some recent apparent setbacks would have affected their vote. I mean, there was a situation of Farage partly blaming the EU and NATO for provoking Russia to invade Ukraine. There was the absolutely disgusting comments from some candidates that were completely racist and appalling. And you just think, is there a sense that the wheels might be coming off this wagon? But it didn't look as though it really had to any great extent.
I think the thing is that those comments probably play quite well to the audience that he's trying to talk to, who probably do share quite a lot of those awful views that we consider abhorrent, but that probably just solidifies the vote for people like Farage and Reform. That's the reality of it. And in a way, the more extreme and the more publicity they grab, the more that support hardens among that 15% of the electorate. That's how hard-right populism works, in my view.
I think at the other end of the spectrum, I'd be really interested to see where the Green Party goes from here, because obviously they've gained 3 seats. I've also seen a lot of noise among kind of younger people on social media in support of them and wanting them to go on from here. So I think that kind of at the two ends of the spectrum, I think it will be interesting to see how they both progress, really.
I think the Greens would have benefited from disillusion among some voters with Labour over its seeming soft words over Gaza and lack of strong line against Netanyahu. I was listening to a documentary with one of the Bristol candidates, who I think won, was Green, where there was a big student population and quite a lot of sense that this isn't the Labour Party they want. I saw some really interesting stats actually about in the kind of Labour heartlands, Labour didn't really increase their share of the vote that much. Whereas it was in those sort of, if you like, the swing areas, the marginals, where they really increased their vote and managed to overtake the Tories or in some cases the Lib Dems. So it feels as though they haven't really done any more than keep hold of their support in those areas. But what they have done is win in areas where previously they wouldn't have held any hope to win those seats. So I think that's a really good indication of a good strategy for winning an election, really. Shall we go on to what we think the new government is likely to mean for our industry? Obviously, political comms is a big part of our sector, and the new government can affect an industry in many different ways. So, Evie, you've been talking to some senior industry figures about the impact the new government might have on PR. What have people been saying?
Generally, people are ready for change. I think it's safe to say. They were basically saying that in the longer term, there are likely to be economic benefits and things like that. But for now, the optimism alone, I think, will really yield results for the rest of the year. That everyone seems quite hopeful. In terms of particular kind of strategy things, I spoke to Emily Morgan, who is MD of Operations and Innovation at Red Consultancy, and she was talking about Labour's social media tactics and saying that she thinks social media will play more of a pivotal role going forward in Labour's comms. I wondered if, in terms of the broader comms industry, whether that will encourage more brands to follow suit and maybe be less reserved about their online presence. I know there are obviously some disruptor brands, things like that are quite vocal on social media in outgoing ways at the moment, but I think we could see that more widely. Emily also mentioned that Labour has long been pressing its desire to work closely with business. She said as a result of that we might see more of a focus on brand partnerships, possibly even some affiliate marketing programs to reach audiences in new ways. We also heard from Sarita Shah, who is Vice President of Strategic Comms at Weber Shandwick. She said that the comms industry could take a lesson in how it preps spokespeople and business leaders from the campaigns we've seen. She said that there's been a perceived inauthenticity from senior politicians and that the media training essentially has almost been too tough on them. As a result of this, we've kind of pigeonholed leaders and given them the style of comms that we think people want them to hear rather than letting them play to their strengths. So I think going forward, comms people should hopefully take lessons from this election and prep their business spokespeople based on what they're actually good at talking about.
I think people should read Evie's piece in PRWeek.com today because it is a good collection of very interesting views from senior PR practitioners about the impact of the election and the result today. Overall, I think having read it, the view is there's optimism that for a long time we've had a political environment which seems very unstable and very bad-tempered, and the economy has suffered as a result of that. And I think a new Labour government coming in hopefully should bring some stability and optimism to the business world, which would be very welcome. I also think the other impact that it'll have on PR is that every PR company and a lot of clients will be looking for consultants who can advise on what the Labour Party is going to do and try and influence that policy. So there's going to be a lot of jostling for voices that really get what this government is going to do and what Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are trying to do. So expect a lot of hires from people who understand or claim to understand New Labour.
Yeah, I expect we're going to see a lot of those kind of Labour units and Labour teams shifting into gear pretty quickly to try to influence what the new government's going to be doing and get the best result for their clients and their employers.
Yeah, and it could be that it's such a big majority that this Labour government may be in power up to a decade as a result of these election results. So if that's the case, then people definitely will want people who can strategically advise on the direction of this government, because it could be a decade of direction.
I think generally there's a sense of feel-good factor, really. This is one of the sort of underlying feelings I'm getting from that article and also on social media, that thank God we can just look forward. And even if it is a slightly intangible thing, and we hope it does lead to positive advantages in terms of the economy and so on, hopefully that might encourage people to, I don't know, celebrate, spend a bit more, maybe have a bit more hope for the future.
Let's hope so, John. I'm going to say something slightly controversial because I think I should. And it's that I think the priority for the business world and for the political world should now be to rejoin the EU. And I say that because if we're going to get real optimism, we need some business growth. And I think the only way Britain is going to get that growth going forward is by opening itself up properly again to European markets and being a bigger voice in the world. I do hope this government, and I think I'm probably backed in that view by majority of the PR industry. I may be going out on a limb here, but that's just my sense.
Yeah, I think you probably are. And I remember years ago, before the EU referendum, we had a survey, didn't we, of agency bosses, and I think a solid majority were in favour of Remain, or at least slightly on the fence. So it does feel like that's the sense. But then we are in the metropolitan elite, aren't we?
Allegedly.
Yeah. I can't really see Starmer sort of shifting on that in this term, but I do think that it does kind of suggest that maybe as we move towards the next term, there might be a sense that things are shifting and the media is shifting and the zeitgeist is shifting, and there might be a bit of room to maneuver. So, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you think, Evie. I mean, you're obviously Gen Z, and I sense that Gen Z has always been much more pro-Europe than maybe other generations. But it does seem to me that the bulk of the people who work in the PR industry and young people coming into the business world want to rejoin the EU.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also from a PR agency perspective, obviously the industry kind of likes collaboration, and especially cross-market collaboration. And with all the M&A going on and things like that at the moment, it seems like it would only make things easier if we were in the EU. I know a lot of bigger agencies have obviously made acquisitions and are looking to make further acquisitions internationally, so it makes that process smoother.
I think so. I think that sense of Britain being the gateway to the European Union was slightly undermined by Brexit. So I think a lot of agency bosses would look forward to that coming back, maybe.
Yeah, and another big factor in whether or not we're going to get optimism in the longer term is also what happens in the American election, I think, because although we've now got a centre-left progressive government here, if the opposite happens in America, that will have a detrimental effect on the business world, I believe. So I think all eyes now turn across the Atlantic for November.
I think one thing that's going to be worth paying attention to is the comms operation at number 10, because obviously we're going to have a new communications director. We might have some other senior comms advisors and media advisors come in. So I think it's going to be really fascinating actually to see how Labour takes its approach to comms when they're in campaigning mode to governing mode. I don't know if that's someone who's got a big presence or is well known outside of these circles, or if it just means someone who's very well respected. And obviously Matthew Doyle can claim to have had a significant victory, but he's not exactly a household name. So it remains to be seen.
I think that's a really good point, and the Downing Street comms director will have a big impact on how this government proceeds. And obviously we've had a string of quite high profile comms directors in Downing Street over the years, from Andy Coulson, Alistair Campbell, we've had Lee Kane. The next one will be fascinating, and whether or not there'll be an ex-journalist and whether or not there'll be a real player in government or whether there'll be more behind the scenes could, as you say, make a real difference to how this government communicates and how it succeeds.
We've seen various different versions of this. We've seen broadcast journalists come in. We've seen sort of former tabloid journalists. We've seen people who've had a comms background and not really a journalistic background, like Katie Perrier, for example. Which way will they go? And it's also worth saying we're going to have some former comms people and public affairs people who will now be in Parliament. That's going to be a fascinating dynamic too, I think, to see comms people take their place on those green seats. Okay, that's all we have time for on this special election edition of Beyond the Noise. If you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access PR Week's Beyond the Noise podcast. Thanks to Danny and to Evie, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.